Well, good morning, everybody. Purpose of this particular video is going to take a look at topic 7.4 on the progressives. Specifically here, we're going to look at progressivism on a national level and a little bit of presidential politics coming into play here as well. So let's go. So to get things started, a little bit of an overview going on with the progressive agenda on a national level. There's still all these little particular ideas and ideals and regional and local city government kind of things that different progressive groups are going for. But on a national level, progressives are looking for both legislation and constitutional amendments that they think would effectively regulate the economy because when there's been an economic panic in the 1870s and then again in the 1890s, it has hurt lots and lots of people. Expanding democracy, and this is something that we've already talked about in class in a couple of different ways, and then trying to generate moral reform. The background belief on all of these issues is trying to help the country make progress. The belief in a democratic government, the belief in a regulated capitalist economy to take care of the needs of the people and to help protect people from themselves through moral reforms. When it comes down to the constitutional amendments, it is worth like the quick mention here that we've seen only two real waves of amendments come through the course of things in class. The Bill of Rights is, of course, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and all those happened in the span of a couple of years in the 1790s. There were a couple of amendments that came in the early part of the 19th century, but more importantly in class, we focus on the Civil War Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, establishing equality under the law for African Americans, and establishing African American voter rights. There are actually four amendments that occur here during the Progressive era. The 16th Amendment establishes an income tax for the first time. For the most part, tax revenue coming to the federal government have been tariffs. This is going to be a benefit. Income taxes is going to be a benefit for generating positive income flow for the U.S. government, but also to maybe help a little bit of free trade and help reduce the size of the tariff. The 17th Amendment is going to mandate the direct election of senators. According to the original Constitution, your two U.S. senators for your state, they were chosen not by the voters, but they were chosen by your state legislature. So this transition away from state legislature to a direct election of senators by your voters, this is a good example of expanding democracy. So we've got right off the bat, we've got regulate the economy, expand democracy. The 18th Amendment is prohibition. That is definitely going to try to generate some moral reform. More on that in the 1920s, how that doesn't exactly work out as planned. And then the 19th Amendment that we've already talked about in class is women's suffrage, which is, again, we're going to see an expansion of democracy that kind of comes from this. So College Board has been pretty good with us about trying to create some categories to put these things in. These categories are also going to be seen as we look at specific pieces of legislation that roll out through the three progressive era presidents. I do think for the most part, when we're looking at progressive era legislation, whether it's under President Roosevelt or under Presidents Taft and Wilson coming up in a little bit, there's a real emphasis here on trying to find ways to regulate the economy. The reason this gets so much attention from the College Board and from me and from the STAR test from that matter is because during the Gilded Age, there was such an emphasis on laissez-faire capitalism, where there was, at least in theory, no regulation of the economy going on at all. That now in the progressive era, there is an idea that you should regulate the economy when it is in the public's best interest, when it is for the common good. So for President Roosevelt, when he takes over in 1901, one of the first things that he promotes is the idea that he wants there to be a square deal for labor unions, for laborers, for the working class in America. Square deal basically means to treat everybody kind of evenly, like all sides being equal, kind of like, a square. So in 1902, when there is a major coal strike that's going on in Pennsylvania and in the Northeast, it looks like this is going to have like dire consequences for folks. Theodore Roosevelt breaks from the norm. Back in the Gilded Age, the standard action for a president was to send in the federal troops to break up the strike and to get things back to work. And in this case, Roosevelt is going to support the strikers, and he is going to send in federal troops to open the mines back up and let these people go back to work and try to get a negotiated deal out for them. And he does help negotiate a deal. They're actually going to get a pay raise. These coal miners are going to get a pay raise, and so this is like in the benefit for the working class. And so a real stark change from what's happening from Gilded Age to Progressive Era. In 1903, the federal government is going to create the Department of Commerce and Labor. It is now separated into two distinct government divisions, but the Department of Commerce and Labor was designed to help oversee regulation of the economy. There's that progressive goal that's in there, but also making sure that you are treating workers, treating laborers, labor unions, giving them a little bit more of an even voice at the table on this. So really a definitive change from what you see during the Gilded Age. In the terms of trusts, in those big businesses, the biggest of the big businesses, Theodore Roosevelt is going to make a name for himself as being a trust buster. This showed up in the president's video that we watched in class. Yawp talks about it kind of tucked away in the back of chapter trying to remember where this was in Yup. It is actually tucked away in the part of chapter 20 that we read in unit 6. Actually, a lot of this stuff is in that section of chapter 20 that we looked at back in unit 6. So Roosevelt is in the belief that trusts may not be good for the economy, that monopolies may not be good. Roosevelt believes that there are actually maybe a couple of different types of trust, and he kind of keeps this very simple for everybody. There are good trusts and bad trusts. Good trusts are the trusts that are going to work well with the regulation and the restraint that they should use in their business practices here with the federal government. Kind of seeing this through Theodore Roosevelt here. The bad trusts are the ones that are bad for economic growth in all sectors. Bad trusts are the ones that should be broken up or be destroyed by the government, as you can kind of see going on in here. So in 1905, Roosevelt makes a real splash when he initiates an antitrust lawsuit against the Northern Securities Company. This is a railroad company that essentially owns every mile of railroad between Chicago and Seattle. You couldn't travel on anything out west without using this one monopolistic company. And Roosevelt, with this lawsuit, as it gets to the Supreme Court, they're going to agree that the trust is a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and it should be broken up under the law. And so as it is broken up under the law, this is the first time that anybody, any sitting president or really anybody else at the federal level is going to attack big business trusts on this kind of issue. Again, this is a significant change from what you see during the Gilded Age. The Progressive Era just means something a little bit different. It's worth the 10 seconds here to point out that the bears in the picture here, those are all based on a hunting trip that Theodore Roosevelt kind of went on where he was hunting black bear. He also was such a notable figure so far as his hunting prowess that bears got to be a sort of a moniker for him in his presidency, and that is in fact where the teddy bears come from in that kind of parlance and lingo. It's because it was a Teddy Roosevelt bear. Teddy bears. The more you know, right? So in one other area of New Deal Square Deal legislation coming out from Roosevelt is going to be in the idea of consumer protection. Let's start this with a little bit of an example of a muckraker. Upton Sinclair wrote a novel published in 1906 called The Jungle. The plot of The Jungle, it follows the lives of several immigrant workers in the city of Chicago, and kind of details the harshness of their day-to-day life. What makes headlines is the fact that the stories in The Jungle are based on real life, and these immigrant workers, even though it's fiction, the characters, the stories are true about the kind of harsh, disgusting conditions that they are working in within the meatpacking industry, where rotten food and food that's been infested with, insects and rodents just kind of being processed and kind of still shipped on for consumption by the American public. Well, this gets a lot of people's attention, including our guy Theodore Roosevelt and members of Congress. So a little bit later in 1906, he works with Congress, and Congress passes the Meat Inspection Act. You can see right here in that photo a group of USDA inspectors that are making sure that the beef is clean and free of any unpleasant odors, any unpleasant marks, any signs of rot or decay. The guidelines set up by the Meat Inspection Act in 1906 are going to go relatively unchanged for really the next 90 years. It's going to be the late 90s when you have any kind of updates made to that. And then there's also the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act is going to require like not warning labels, but in the direction of like ingredient lists, where you're going to tell people exactly what's in the food that you're selling. And it's really a question of trying to make sure that you're restoring faith of consumers back in the product that they are buying. All of this is designed to take care of the little person, like the average American, but it's also designed to regulate the economy to make sure that American interests are being protected. A lot of activity coming from the 7.5 years of President Theodore Roosevelt. So much positive activity happening during the Roosevelt years that even though he decides he is going to step away after the 1908 election and let somebody else be president, he is still trying to exert some influence through this. So in 1909, the new president on the scene is President William Howard Taft. Taft is really designed to be, chosen by Roosevelt, designed to be like another Theodore Roosevelt. And so while he is in office, he is going to instigate more antitrust lawsuits. Actually, in like 4 years, he does twice as many antitrust lawsuits trying to break up big business. He does twice as many as what Roosevelt did. Even though Taft is only in for 4 years and Roosevelt was in for 7 years, this is like a lot of progressive activity that's going on. The other big notable accomplishment that happens during Taft's presidency is the ratification of the 16th Amendment. So you're going to have like income taxes and maybe some tariff reductions starting to come into play. But the real story for Taft is that he is not quite the same kind of outward personality that Theodore Roosevelt is. And he is seen by members of the media as being a little bit of a manipulated figure, trying to pull things back closer to big business. Remember, in the Gilded Age, the Republican Party was the party of big business, and now it is President Roosevelt, even though he's a Republican, he is really pushing this progressive agenda. So by like 1910 going into 1911, there's kind of like a real harsh split in there, and the progressive Republicans, they don't like Taft as much as they liked Roosevelt, and so now there's questions about, well, what should happen with the 1912 election? So in that 1912 election, the Republicans they start going through this whole process that is the new process, everybody, the direct primary elections. In those primary elections, Roosevelt starts winning state after state after state, to the point that, I mean, Taft is okay, but Roosevelt is clearly doing better. For example, Taft is from Ohio. When Ohio holds their Republican primary, Roosevelt wins the primary election. So it looks like Roosevelt is back in. But when the Republicans hold their nominating convention, at the convention, the Republican leadership chose to ignore the primary results, and they nominated Taft anyway. And so the split in the Republican Party is going to get even worse in this because now it is a split that's going to hold true into election season. And as a result, Roosevelt and progressive Republicans, they storm out of the Republican Party and they establish a new political party called the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party because their guy is going to be Theodore Roosevelt. And he was, one of the slogans was, he's as strong as a bull moose fighting for the rights of the American people. So now you've got two Republicans, kind of, sort of, Taft on the Republican side, Roosevelt on the progressive side, going to split loyalties among a lot of Republican voters. The Democratic nominee in this case, they choose Woodrow Wilson, who is kind of a political novice. He's been the governor of New Jersey only for a couple of years, but he has a strong political science background. He's kind of got that intellectual progressivism kind of going on about him. So you've got 1, 2, 3 candidates, just so we can leave no stone unturned here. Running for the Socialist Party is our guy Eugene Debs. You might remember him from back in Unit 6, where he was leader of a railroad strike, the Pullman strike in the 1890s, turned to socialism, running for president on a regular basis. When this comes to the polls in November of 1912, by the popular vote, it looks like a pretty interesting split. Wilson only gets 41% of the vote, and Debs, I think earlier in class I may have said he got 10% of the vote. He got 6% of the vote here. That's his peak percentage that he gets, but he does get almost 1 million votes in his direction, which is pretty good for a socialist candidate. But Wilson is going to come out first place on this. But I hope you know that it's not the popular vote that matters. It's the Electoral College that matters. And when you start adding up all of the electoral votes from all of these different states, it is not even close. It is a landslide electoral vote win for Woodrow Wilson. So if you're trying to figure out how did that happen so directly, so overwhelmingly for Wilson, the reality is that Wilson wins because in each state, Wilson got the most votes, and Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican voters in those states. If you look at the popular vote totals on this, you can do the quick math and figure out that Taft and Roosevelt together, that adds up to right at 50% of the total vote. So Roosevelt, later in life, called his decision to run in 1912 the biggest mistake that he ever made, because he felt wholeheartedly that it was his fault that the Republicans lost this election, and that intellectual fool Woodrow Wilson got into the White House. Which, be that as it may, Woodrow Wilson is going to take some real serious steps and carry the country well into the progressive part of the 20th, really into the 21st century. So just like we did with President Roosevelt, here with President Wilson, we should take a look at what he does in terms of economic regulation for the United States. So he is going to work with Congress, and Congress is going to help regulate big business and regulate the trusts. They're going to create the Federal Trade Commission. Federal Trade Commission is designed to oversee federal trade, and it's their job to make sure that there are fair trading practices going on everywhere. Don't have to wait for complaints. They can use investigative power to make sure that there are no monopolistic practices that are coming into play. This is still around these days, and when they talk about monopolistic practices, whether it's Microsoft or Google or Apple or Ticketmaster, the Federal Trade Commission has investigative control over this. There is also a new antitrust act that happens in 1914. It is going to give the federal government even more tools to make sure that monopolistic trusts are going to be broken up to help better protect the average American worker and the average American consumer. In terms of taxes and trade and tariff, the Revenue Act of 1913 is the first tariff that's going to be reduced and is going to see an institution of an income tax. It is a progressive income tax. Like how the term fits with the time period, this type of progressive income tax means the more money you earn, the higher your tax rate is going to be. And it is minuscule by 2023 standards so far as tax rates are concerned, but as the first ever income tax, it does give a sense that maybe this is a way that Andrew Carnegie's idea of the gospel of wealth can now be implemented through a government program to make sure that the money is going to go in directions where the government sees a need for the common good. And then to regulate the banking industry, the Congress is going to create the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 is going to take a national banking system and split it up into 12 districts, and each district is going to be in charge of oversight and regulation and cooperation with privately owned banks. These Federal Reserve banks are going to help distribute a common currency. The dollar bills that you have in your possession, they all have the words Federal Reserve Note on them because they have their basis in this piece of legislation. So when we're looking at what's going on here with Wilson, everything on here, all of these laws, or at least in the spirit of these laws, they are all still in effect today in 2023. Federal Reserve System, income taxes have changed over the century, but the spirit of the initial income tax is still there. Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act, these are laws that are still on the books and still affect our lives on a regular basis. So when we talk about how the progressive era is representing a move towards a more modern America, I think that's a pretty good piece of evidence to kind of bring to the table to help prove that point. Thanks for hanging out and listening. I'll see you in class.